Peace be upon you and welcome to Connect Quran. Before talking about the miraculous structure of the Holy Quran that I discovered by the grace of Allah during last couple of years, I would like to address some key questions around this topic first. When it comes to reading and understanding Quran, it is not uncommon to think that why Quran is not in any specific order or why Quran does not have an organized structure. Meaning, why doesn't it have a systematic arrangement of topics? And we ask these questions because we know that an organized structure is critical to bring clarity in the message. Now, instead of answering these questions, I would pose alternate questions. Does Quran really not have an organized structure? And what if Quran does have an organized structure, but we are not putting enough effort to fully explore it? Let's see what Quran is telling us about this puzzle. The first verse of chapter 11 reads, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Alif Lam Ra Kitabun uhkimat ayatuh Thumma fussilat min ladun hakimin khabir. The word Summa in this verse indicates the occurrence of two events in a sequence with some time gap. So the verse involves in a two-step process. The word hakama means to judge, to settle, to resolve, and the word fasala means to separate, to divide, to segregate, meaning to set things apart from one another. So now let's translate this verse. Alif Lam Ra Kitabun uhkimat ayatuh. So in the first step, a book was caused to be judged by its verses. Or we can also say a book was settled through its verses. Then, in the next step, fussilat. It was divided into distinct parts or sections. By whom? Milladun hakimin khabir. By the one who is all wise, all aware. So the first step deals with the establishment of the book. And the second step deals with its subsequent division into various parts or sections. To better understand this verse, let's go back in time when the Quran was being revealed. It is very clear from the contents of Quran that it was not revealed in one go, but it was revealed over time. We can also see that Quran talks about many different themes. For example, belief, resurrection, prophethood, laws, moral teachings, social obligations, etc. And it talks about hundreds of topics within those themes. It also talks about many different times. For example, past, present, future, even timeless concepts. Quran speak to different audiences. For example, people in general, believers, disbelievers, hypocrites, and those people who were given the scripture before. For example, Jews and Christians. So it is not hard to imagine that it is more than likely that Quran will be addressing many different topics that will be occurring around the same time. Let's take a very simple example. There are many verses in the Quran where people are asking questions to the Prophet Muhammad, and the answers to their questions are being provided by means of revelations or verses. Let's say some of those questions were asked in a public gathering in the following order. For example, people ask about the new moon, Yas'alunaka anil ahilla, and verse VW was revealed to answer that question. Then people ask about orphans, Yas'alunaka anil yatama, and the verse VX was revealed to answer that question. Then people ask about the last day, Yas'alunaka anis sa'ah, and the verse VY was revealed to answer that question. And then people ask about war spoils, Yas'alunaka anil anfal, so the verse VZ was revealed to answer that question. Imagine these verses were being compiled in the order they were being received. So they are in chronological order. Now let's see what is happening here. If we go from left to right, the first verse will be on the topic of natural phenomena. The second verse will be on the topic of social obligation. The third verse will be on the topic of resurrection. And the fourth verse will be on the topic of war protocols. So it is going to be a random arrangement of topics. Now consider so many different factors that I just mentioned earlier, and you would know that this random arrangement of topics is only going to get more and more intermixed as we move forward in time and more verses are added in the book. So now we can easily envision that the Quran, which was being compiled in a chronological order at the time of its revelation, had an unstructured random arrangement of topics. And that is why the first part of the verse 11:1 reads that a book was settled through its verses, meaning despite of having unstructured random arrangement of topics, the book achieved recognition in the society just because of the impact, authority, and the influence of its verses. Then the next step occurred. So the second part of the verse 11:1 tells us that the book was divided into distinct parts or sections, meaning the verses were grouped together to form different parts or sections. Now this step would be meaningless and will not make any sense at all if these parts or sections are not organized to address different themes, topics, or subject matters in a structured manner. So now Quran would have an unchronological order, but it has to have a well-structured, systematic arrangement of topics. In fact, the structure must look like something beyond human capacity in order to establish that it was done by all wise, all aware, as stated in the above verse. Now a valid question arises that why Allah sorted out this book from an unstructured random arrangement of topics into a well-structured systematic arrangement of topics when the book was already established. This is because people at that time were implementing verses of the Holy Quran in their lives as the verses were being received or revealed. So the possibility of confusion was very narrow. And even then, if someone had confusion about something, they could just go and ask the Prophet to provide clarity. But after the death of the Prophet, the book has to speak for itself. So no one has to rely on their forefathers to find the truth and the right path. So the answer to the question that does Quran have an organized structure is Quran must have an organized structure which must be miraculous in nature, and it must provide clarity to its contents. So the next logical question is, how is it relevant today? So let me walk you through that why it has become essential for us to explore, understand, and utilize the structure of the Holy Quran for its interpretation in today's time. When it comes to following Quran as a religious guide, there are two groups. One that follows Quran and Hadith as an authority. Second, that only takes Quran as an authoritative text. For those who don't know, Hadith are sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on whom the Holy Quran was revealed. And these Hadiths were collected and compiled hundreds of years after his death by a method called chain of narrations, which means person X heard from person Y, who heard from person Z, and it goes on until it gets to the Prophet. If you think about it for a moment, it raises several key questions. For example, why this authoritative text was kept out of Quran at first place? Why this job of collecting and compiling Hadith as an authoritative text was left on random people without mentioning its need anywhere in the Quran? What were people following before the compilation of Hadith? Can we trust that history which is written by humans is free from errors and biases? Can we rely upon the narrators without being able to determine their true faith, as the Prophet himself was not able to do so?
Even if we assume the reliability of narrators and their good intentions, how can we still ignore unintentional message distortions caused by perception of the receiver and delivery of the messenger? These and similar type of questions raise some serious concerns about hadith being an authoritative text. So this group, whom I have been a part of, comes up with the following justifications. Number 1, Allah commands us in Quran that we must obey Allah and we must obey his messenger. Second, Quran lacks details. And then third, Quran lacks context. If you pay close attention to these supporting arguments, you will quickly come to realize that on one hand, they are accepting the authority of Quran, but at the same time, they are undermining the very same book. So let's have a deeper look on these arguments one by one. So first of all, let's talk about the assumption that obeying Allah and obeying his messenger are two different things, where obeying Allah means following Quran and obeying messenger means following hadith. Let's get to the basics. The foundation of Islam is acknowledging the fact that there is no God but Allah, La ilaha illallah, and then submitting to him. Chapter 2 verses 130 and 131 reads, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومن يرغب عن ملة إبراهيم إلا من سفه نفسه ولقد اصطفيناه في الدنيا وإنه في الآخرة لمن الصالحين إذ قال له ربه أسلم قال أسلمت لرب العالمين. And its translation goes like, who can be reluctant from following the creed of Ibrahim, except the one who devalued or wasted itself? We have certainly chosen Ibrahim in this present life. He has been appointed a role model for people as per 2:124, and he will certainly be among the righteous in the hereafter. When his Lord told him to submit, he said, I submit to the Lord of the worlds. Okay, so how can we submit to Allah? Or what are we supposed to do? Basically, Allah sends down law or code of conduct to the people with an instruction to comply with it. And this happens to be Quran for us, being the latest scripture. However, Allah does not send it down to all the people individually. Rather, he chooses a person from among the people. And that person is called Prophet. Then Allah reveals the law or code of conduct to the Prophet. So a Prophet has two responsibilities. One is adherence, so he has to obey the law. And second, transmittance, which means passing down the message to the people. Now, as you can see that we don't receive the message directly from Allah, and the message is actually delivered to us through a messenger with instruction to comply with it. So if we obey the messenger, we are automatically obeying Allah. That is why the Quran also reads, مَن يُطِعِ الرَّسُولَ فَقَدْ أَطَاعَ اللَّهَ. Whoever obeys the messenger, then that person has certainly obeyed Allah. So, obeying Allah and obeying his messenger does not mean following Quran and Hadith, but it simply refers to following Quran. And this has also been confirmed by the messenger himself in the following verse. وَإِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُنَا بَيِّنَاتٍ قَالَ الَّذِينَ لَا يَرْجُونَ لِقَاءَنَا ائْتِ بِقُرْآنٍ غَيْرِ هَذَا أَوْ بَدِّلْهُ قُلْ مَا يَكُونُ لِي أَنْ أُبَدِّلَهُ مِنْ تِلْقَاءِ نَفْسِي إِنْ أَتَّبِعُ إِلَّا مَا يُوحَى إِلَيَّ إِنِّي أَخَافُ إِنْ عَصَيْتُ رَبِّي عَذَابَ يَوْمٍ عَظِيمٍ. And its translation is, Whenever compelling revelations are recited to them, those who don't expect meeting us say, "Bring a Quran other than this, or change this." Say, "It's not possible for me to change it on my own. I follow nothing but what is revealed to me." Meaning, I only follow this Quran. I fear the torment of tremendous day if I disobey my Lord. As you can see and read from this verse that the Prophet only followed Quran and he feared to disobey his Lord by not doing so. Thus for Prophet himself, obedience means following the Quran. And thus associating anything to the Prophet in the name of Hadith which carries an authoritative statement beyond Quran is an absolute negation of his own statement. Thus we must be very clear that any Hadith which adds anything beyond the teachings of Quran is just a fabrication under the name of the Prophet and nothing else. And the phrase obey Allah and obey the Messenger simply means to follow the Quran.
So now let's talk about the second argument, that Quran lacks details. Chapter 2 verse 2 reads, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين. That's the book, there is no doubt in it, a guide for the mindful. Now as you can see, the verse reads, that's the book, mean that's all you need, which is a guide for the mindful. It does not read that this book plus tens of other books are a guide for the mindful people. Also think about guide as a user manual. Now if people or manufacturers can make user manuals that are so comprehensive that it does not need additional resources to figure out something, how can you even think that Lord of the worlds, God, Allah, has left the user manual incomplete? Also chapter 16 verse 89 reads, وَيَوْمَ نَبْعَثُ فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ شَهِيدًا عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ أَنفُسِهِمْ وَجِئْنَا بِكَ شَهِيدًا عَلَى هَؤُلَاءِ وَنَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَهُدًى وَرَحْمَةً وَبُشْرَى لِلْمُسْلِمِينَ. And its translation reads, the day we will raise a witness from each community against them from among themselves, and we will bring you, O Prophet, as a witness against these disbelievers. You will witness that we sent down the scripture to you, providing details for all things that were needed to be successful in the hereafter, and which served as a guide, mercy, and good news for the submitters. So as you can see that the argument that Quran lacks details is in direct contradiction with verse 2.2 and verse 1689. So it has no grounds. Now let's talk about the third argument, that Quran lacks context. This assumption is supported by the following statements, that the context of Quran is provided by Hadith, or it is provided by historical cultural practices of a particular region. As per Talk Quran, Hadith only provide context of about 570 verses, which is less than 10%. Even if we become generous, it would still be less than 20%. So what about more than 80% of the verses? On the other hand, when it is claimed that the context is derived from historical cultural practices of a particular region, then we should remember that Quran is a guide for the whole world and at all times. So it has to be independent of these factors. Thus our reliance on both of these sources to get context of the verses of Quran is seriously problematic. We should also remember that context is of fundamental importance as it provides meaning and clarity to the intended message. So context cannot be left out from any authentic text.
For example, context help us assign meanings to the words which may have multiple meanings. Let's take the example of the word break. Read the sentences below to see how the same word is used to deliver very different message based on different context. Similarly, context help us determine if something is said figuratively or literally. Let's take the example of the word bitten off and see how it delivers different messages in different sentences based on different context. We can also exclude some information from a sentence if the context is already clear from the preceding text. Without context, a piece of information is just a dot. It floats in your brain with lots of other dots and does not mean a thing. Knowledge is information in context, connecting the dots. Basically, content without sufficient context is just useless. And when it comes to Quran, we make the claim that it was compiled without preserving the context of its verses in it. And on the other hand, we are acknowledging the fact that it has been preserved word by word for many, many centuries. So if we combine these two statements together, we are essentially saying that we have an unpreserved book which has been perfectly preserved for centuries. So the argument that Quran lacks context is quite absurd and does not have a leg to stand on. So the arguments that obeying Allah and obeying His messengers are two different things, and Quran lacks details and Quran lacks context, are not only baseless and untrue, but they also undermine the words of Allah. So they are part of the big problems. Another problem is treating multiple meaning words as single meaning words. For most part, this problem is common between the two groups. And all of these problems have led us developing poor understanding about some key issues, such as ritual prayer, pilgrimage protocols, alms tax, the concept of intercession, the coming of the last day, women rights, the dynamics of husband-wife relationship, divorce protocols, even inheritance distribution, and the list just goes on. So what can we do about it? Or what is the solution for it? The answer is simple and straightforward, that we need to correct our mistakes. Our number one mistake is the assumption that obeying Allah and obeying His Messenger are two different things. We must realize that obeying Allah and obeying His Messenger is just one thing, which means following Quran. Our second mistake is the assumption that Quran lacks details, and we must understand that Quran is fully detailed. Our third mistake is that Quran lacks context, and we must understand that Quran does provide context of its all verses. And finally, we should stop thinking that words may only have one meaning. In fact, we should acknowledge that words may have multiple meanings, and we must assign appropriate meanings to the words based on the context they are used in. Now, the first two problems can easily be addressed just by changing our approach or attitude towards these problems. However, it does require some work to address problems number 3 and 4, because it involves understanding the structure of the Holy Quran. Once we understand the structure of the Holy Quran, we can determine the context of its verses. And once we have the context of its verses, we can assign appropriate meanings to the words which may have multiple meanings. So both of these problems can be solved simultaneously if we understand the structure of the Holy Quran. Now it's time to talk about the structure of the Holy Quran.
As we expect a heavenly structure of the Holy Quran, some people have identified ring composition in it, while others have identified its fractal design. I will very briefly talk about these concepts here in this video and will provide links on these topics in the description below for more details. In ring composition, first element is connected to the last, second element is connected to the second last, and so on. So if there are 6 elements in total, first would be connected to the sixth, second would be connected to the fifth, and third element would be connected to the fourth element. In fractal design, a simple shape or element is repeated many times over to make a complex shape. In my experience and understanding, a combination of both ring composition and fractal design forms the structure of the Holy Quran.
Inshallah, I will explain the structure of Quran with simple terminologies. Basically, Quran has 114 chapters.
And these chapters don't seem to have sections, subsections, and paragraphs, but we do need to find them.
A section is used to signal a transition in narrative. So a section is a point where subject matter changes, but we are still discussing a particular aspect of a larger subject. And a paragraph is used to describe a single point or theme and may have one or more sentences. If we ponder upon or reflect upon Quran, we can identify sections, subsections, and paragraphs in it. There are two types of sections in Quran. Number one, standalone section, and number two is combined section. A standalone section may have two or more than two verses. And in a standalone section, the flow of information is sequential. For example, if we have a standalone section which has 3 verses, then it would make sense to read them in order from 1 to 3. On the other hand, a combined section may have 3 or more than 3 verses. Also, in a combined section, the flow of information may or may not be sequential. A combined section can be further broken down into 3 types. So let's talk about type 1 first. In type 1, a combined section can be broken down into 3 parts: the beginning part, an ending part, and a middle or center part. The beginning and ending parts together form the outer topic, whereas the middle or central part forms the inner topic. Now there has to be at least one verse in each of these parts, and in that case the flow of information would be sequential. The number of verses may vary between the parts of inner and outer topics, but it should be remembered that the number of verses in the beginning and ending parts would always be identical. Now let's take a different example. Let's say there are 5 verses in each of the beginning and ending parts. However, the arrangement of these verses is such that the 5 verses in the beginning part form 2 pairs. One pair of 2 verses and then second pair of 3 verses. And then this pattern is reversed in the ending part. And then the middle part has 2 verses. So in this case, the flow of information may not be sequential. For example, the 2 verses from the starting end of the beginning part may connect to the 2 verses at the closing end of the ending part. And then 3 verses from the beginning part may connect to the 3 verses from the ending part. So then the flow of information would follow this pattern. And even the inner topic, instead of 2 verses, may have 4 verses with its own unique pattern. For example, verse number 1 may be connected to verse number 4, and then 3 may be connected to 2. Thus, the flow of information may not be sequential and follow this pattern. Now, these are just hypothetical examples, and each combined section that carries non-sequential flows may have its unique patterns. The second type of a combined section carries 5 parts: a beginning part, a middle part, an ending part, an upper middle part, and a lower middle part. And in this arrangement, the beginning part, the middle part, and the ending part together form the outer topic. And the upper middle part and the lower middle part form the inner topic. Similar to type 1, the outer and the inner topics may either have sequential flows or non-sequential flows by means of unique patterns. Type 3 of a combined section also has three parts: a beginning part, an ending part, and a middle or central part. Again, the beginning and ending parts form the outer topic, and the middle or central part consists of several standalone or combined sections. It is important to note that the connectivity among different sections is remarkable. For instance, let's say a chapter has 5 sections: a standalone section, then another standalone section, followed by a combined section. Let's put it in order. Then another similar combined section, and then a standalone section in the end. So the first standalone section will be connected to the second standalone section, and then the second standalone section will be connected to the outer topic of the combined section. And then the outer topic will be connected to the inner topic, and then the inner topic will be connected to the outer topic of the next combined section. Then the outer topic will be connected again to the inner topic, and then the inner topic will be connected to the standalone section in the end. This connectivity among different sections may be associated with different aspects, and the strength of these connections will also vary from sections to sections. However, this connectivity does not even break if we go from one chapter to the next. For example, let's say the last section of chapter X is a standalone section, and then the first section of chapter Y is also a standalone section. Then the standalone section of chapter X would be connected to the first standalone section of the chapter Y. Similarly, if the last section of chapter A is a combined section and the first section of chapter B is a standalone section, then the inner topic of the last section of chapter A would be connected to the standalone section of chapter B. Now, this miraculous structure of Holy Quran is well beyond human styles, imaginations, and abilities. So this is more than enough for me to establish the divine nature of this book. But your mind will further get blown away by its linguistic eloquence, authoritative language, accuracy, consistency, truthfulness, depth. It says so much with so little words, and above all, provision of best way of life. Now, I have already said that there are a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings in the mainstream. So hold on to your criticism until you learn what Islam is by yourself from the Quran itself. I would like to note that the structure of the Holy Quran presented in this video is based on my research on about 50% of the Holy Quran. And my work is ongoing, which will take a couple of more years to complete, inshallah. Another super important note is that I will put the relevant verses of the Holy Quran together just for the sake of understanding, based on their connections. And it goes without saying that the recitation of Quran will always be the same as it is written. So now let's talk about the two essential skills that are required to interpret and understand the Holy Quran. Typically, we are taught that we need to be an expert in Arabic language in its all forms, including reading, writing, and speaking. And we must have a knowledge of Islamic history in order to understand Quran. And this throws many people off from putting an effort to understand Quran because they think that these are unachievable tasks for them. So if you are one of these people, then let me tell you this, that you need none of that to understand Quran. Yes, we do need knowledge of Quranic grammar and vocabulary, but it is very different than mastering a language. Every language has some grammatical rules, and we learn these rules based on whatever language we speak. So, this skill is easily transferable. And in terms of vocabulary, about 400 words make more than 80% of the Holy Quran. So, we can get it covered very easily. And for the remaining words, we can use several online resources. I will put some useful links in the description of this video, so check them out. In short, if we spend some good 4 to 6 months on this, we will get the language part covered very well. The second skill we need to understand Quran is critical thinking, which is taking the logical thinking one step further. Where logical thinking is taking the rational steps and analyzing the factual information to draw conclusions, critical thinking is further questioning and scrutinizing the information received from logical thinking. And in case of Quran, critical thinking needs to build upon system thinking. This is because Quran deals with complex interactions among various elements and interconnectivity, both in terms of its structure and content. So, getting a clear and accurate picture of interrelationships and interconnections among various elements, factors, and processes is super critical for clear understanding of its teachings. And the two components of system thinking will help us to achieve that. These components are synthetical thinking, which is about finding similarities and repeated patterns, which help us to understand how things work together, and analytical thinking, which is about identifying differences and to break things down into their parts to better understand different components of a system. In a nutshell, critical thinking is really a key to understand Quran. So, as opposed to common perception, language is not a barrier towards understanding Quran. But lack of critical thinking is a real barrier towards understanding Quran. And that is alike for someone who speaks Arabic and for someone who does not. With that note, I would like to conclude this video. Please help me to spread the message by sharing this video on your social media platforms. And don't forget to subscribe this channel if you haven't done it already. Thanks a lot for listening and stay tuned for the next video, which would be the interpretation of chapter 1, Al-Fatiha, inshallah.